Over the past year, under the bourgeois regime in the United States, a massive wave of repression, detention, forced removal, and violence against immigrants have been unleashed, upending families and communities. In the face of these attacks on immigrants and the working class more broadly, it is imperative that we ask ourselves certain questions, including what is immigration? What causes it? What drives these attacks on immigrants? And what can be done to fight back and stop this assault on immigrants in the working class? These are the questions we will answer today by exploring and applying the revolutionary scientific Marxist program of the International Communist Party, which carries forward the flame of the communist revolution by maintaining a correct Marxist program and struggling against opportunism in its many manifestations, including electoralism, pacifism, and activism. We will take this program and apply it in two parts. First, the material basis driving immigration under capitalism. Second, the struggle of immigrant workers in the class struggle and labor movement, including the way forward and how to fight back. Capitalism is a system defined by its all-consuming drive for profit, the domination of the capitalist class and its imperialist states, the appropriation and exploitation of the surplus value created by the working class's labor, and recurring crises of profitability driven by overproduction. Ultimately, these crises drive the ruling classes into war against rival imperialist nations, dragging the working class into their conflicts to restart the accumulation cycle through mass destruction of people and property. As capitalism continues its violent march towards continuous expansion, wetting the earth with blood, sweat, and tears of the laboring masses, workers of the world are forcibly shoved en masse to the borders of foreign nations in search of reprieve. Over 120 million people have been displaced from their homes in recent years due to violence, conflicts, and crises that inevitably arise from capitalism, whether it be from internal market crisis or imperialist pressure. With little to no other choice, they find themselves uprooted and on the path toward the developed countries in the dominant imperialist blocs where they face new problems. As desperation increases for the bourgeoisie to reserve the falling rate of profit, the heightening of the contradictions inherent in capitalism will also intensify, producing further crisis and war, and more workers will consequently be displaced globally. Capitalism, under which the market in commodities and capital has become fully globalized, cannot avoid the same happening as far as the labor power commodity is concerned. That waves of people in search of wages are crossing the boundaries between North and South, East and West, and clamoring over state and national borders is very sad, but it is also a progressive factor insofar as it demonstrates the international nature of the working class as a single global class of the exploited. The material foundations of this international capitalist economy set the foundation for the future communist one. Capitalism develops an internationally connected humanity and economy that, once liberated from the social relations of capitalism marked by private property, will serve as the material basis for a world without borders. And as the scars of capitalist social relations heal, a society unfettered by the need for a coercive state apparatus and borders will arise. In the present, the coercive use of the state apparatus and its immigration policy, whether from the Trump administration's mass deportations and overt repression, or from the Biden administration's supposedly more benevolent approach, it is not ultimately driven by individual politicians or personal ideologies. Both ruling class parties impose brutality on the border and use the militarized immigration policing state apparatus to facilitate arrest and deportations. For example, the bourgeoisie, headed by the Obama administration, deported 2.9 million people in its first term following the economic crisis of the late 2010s. The current attacks on immigrant workers have little to do with the fascistic sentiments of individual politicians, and instead are rooted in the labor demands of the crisis-ridden capitalist system for which they are merely pawns. Regardless of the national mythologies of the liberal bourgeois of the United States as a country of immigrants, the immigration policy has always been set by the labor demands of capital. To see these dynamics operating, look at the direction of US immigration policy over the last year. The state is expanding enforcement by fusing together surveillance, fast-track removals, detention expansion, and the shrinking of legal pathways as capitalism continues to attempt to combat the self-made crisis of accumulation and overproduction, marked by no longer needing as many workers as the post-COVID economic boom collapses. For example, the USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, halted immigration applications for people from 75 countries, a list that was recently expanded this last week, and launched a sweeping reevaluation of pending cases, essentially blocking many people's ability to migrate to the United States, including from countries like Sudan, Syria, Haiti, and many others. Alongside restricting and slowing formal routes, the state is rapidly stripping temporary protections from large numbers of workers already here. More than 1.5 million immigrants are losing or set to lose temporary legal status through the termination of programs such as temporary protected status and humanitarian parole. As capital labor's needs ebb in the face of a decreased ability to accumulate capital, the flow of immigrants is restricted, and those already here are forcibly removed. Beyond law and paperwork, the state's repression and detention apparatus is being physically enlarged to facilitate this control of labor. ICE is planning to convert industrial warehouses into detention sites designed to hold more than 80,000 people at a time. ICE detention has climbed to around 69,000 people with severe overcrowding and deteriorating conditions. Taken together, this is the shape of the current moment: an expanding state apparatus that combines data, policing, detention, and military force to control and manage the movement of immigrants, while narrowing legal routes and manufacturing larger pools of deportable, easily exploited in fear and disciplined labor. Racism and moral panic concerning immigrants are used to justify this repressive measures, creating panic about crime and violence. Trump and other bourgeois politicians proclaim that they will stop border crossings and unleash mass deportations. However, the goal is not to stop the flow of immigrants, but to regulate it and maintain immigrants as labor available to be used at a higher rate of exploitation. Hysterics about crime are also used to drive division and racism in the working class, scapegoating immigrants as sources of the drug epidemic, economic crisis, and poor living standards, problems that are created by the bourgeoisie. Across US history and beyond, capitalism has used immigration to expand the labor supply, put downward pressure on wages, and weaken working class organization during times of economic booms. And when economic crisis inevitably comes, immigrants are scapegoated to deflect class anger and to justify the repression needed to contract the labor supply and to regulate and control the surplus population. This pattern appears historically, for example, at the close of the Civil War. Booming westward railroad construction, mining, and agricultural development led to the growing demand for labor and enlarging union activity across the country. Subsequently came the mass recruitment of Chinese laborers by railroad companies under restrictive contracts to undercut domestic unions. And then, with the onset of the financial panic of 1873, unemployment grew to 14 to 18%. Class antagonism sharpened, and the Chinese immigrant labor force served as a racialized buffer used by capital during the boom to cheapen wages and then demonized during the bust to deflect class anger, culminating in the first federal legislation restricting immigration, the Page Act in 1875. Fast forward into 2023, immigrant labor accounted for 18.6% of the labor force. After the pandemic era of intensified economic crisis, stimulus checks and interest rates drove economic recovery. Thus, immigrants filled many needed jobs in manufacturing and construction. But now, as job opening growth decelerates and the need for immigrant labor goes bust, a wave of repression and removal is unleashed. Modern immigration policy in the United States has its origin in the 1942 Bracero Program, which were a series of agreements made between the aspiring Mexican bourgeoisie and the now dominant American bourgeoisie to supply American agricultural and railroad industries with cheap, brutally exploited Mexican labor to replace workers that were off dying in the imperialist World War II. Then, with World War II having ended and American workers back in the US in 1952, the US launched a military-style deportation, disgustingly called Operation Wetback, to reorganize labor markets and pull from the National Labor Reserve. Mexican workers became unneeded to the capitalist class once the imperialist war economy ended, and thus deportations ensued. Ultimately, the capitalist economy is on the verge of collapse because of the inevitable crisis of overproduction of goods and capital and the inexorable decline in the profit rate. The only solution available to the bourgeoisie of all countries against this catastrophic blockade of global markets is to unleash a new war, a new world slaughterhouse to destroy excess goods, putting the proletariat of the different states once again against each other. To this end, it is essential for them to return to the nationalist, populist, sovereign propaganda that not by chance is beginning to take root in every country and that has among its pillars fear and hatred of foreigners and immigrants. These very borders that keep workers from freely moving and connecting amongst ourselves will again become the front lines where proletariats are slaughtered in imperialist wars. It is why the manifesto of our party, we promptly declare, working men have no country. To fight back against these attacks by the capitalist class, it is essential that we organize along class lines, rejecting the racial divisions historically used by the bourgeoisie to divide and conquer, and embrace native and immigrant workers inside the same class economic defense organizations, unified in strike action and organization. And where collaborationist and boss-linked leadership dominates the unions, as it does across most of the United States and internationally, we must struggle against this opportunist leadership by uniting class union forces to form a united class union front, whom are workers who organize on the basis that we are wage earners with no common interest with the bosses, embracing internationalism, rejecting defense of the nation, and fighting for unconstrained, generalized strike action that brings the whole working class into struggle for demands that meet workers' needs, including higher wages and shorter hours without a cut in pay. Yeah. These class union forces must unite, and as conditions mature for a return to class combativity, carry out the organizing work needed to move toward the class union, including finding unity in the struggle, unionizing immigrant workers, and fighting together to overcome any divisions that may foment downward competition between proletarians. This unity cannot be built on idealistic bourgeois sentiments or appeals to human rights, as the progressive liberals so often propose. To fight sickening racism with anti-racism in terms of superficial moralism and respective cultures is not only helpless, but it is harmful. This is because it does not challenge any of the profound material basis of this reactionary ideology. The only true anti-racist struggle is and will be the class struggle, because it unifies workers beyond races and nationalities, and it leads them to going beyond capitalism. At the same time, we must avoid the traps of localism, which appear today in the form of sanctuary city policies and local governments declaring toothless states of emergency. These measures leave the federal machinery intact and keep immigrant workers under the same threats of raids and deportations while channeling anger into harmless administrative gestures. The urgency of uniting the class and reconstituting class organization comes in part from the brutal conditions immigrant workers face. Alongside adult immigrant labor, undocumented child labor is used in the United States in factories, construction, and other physically intensive industries. It is estimated that 200,000 immigrant children are employed in extremely dangerous and hazardous workplaces in the United States. All of this harkens back to Marx's statement that abolishing child labor under capitalism is nothing but a pious wish. Compared to native-born workers, undocumented workers are far less likely to be unionized due to fear of being discovered. And because employers can deter fight back and any organizing by threatening to notify ICE at any moment. Yet, immigrant laborers have organized before, even in harsh and dangerous conditions. And this history provides real lessons for today. Immigrant workers can organize powerfully when the movement is rooted in class union principles rather than nationalism or collaborationism. Early labor organizations such as the Industrial Workers of the World organized immigrant workers across industries, and despite the abandonment of immigrant workers by conservative AFL unions, proved that immigrant workers could fight and win in combative mass strikes, like the 25,000 textile worker Bread and Roses strike of 1912, which united workers of over 50 different nationalities and won their collective demands for better wages. Oftentimes, proletarian fight back and rage is seen in bursts as it floods into the street. For example, this past year in Los Angeles, a proletarian uprising responded to mass state attacks on immigrants, and the ruling class escalated by deploying National Guard troops. This show of force is meant to further discipline and demoralize labor and reallocate its expendable wage slaves according to the changing needs of accumulation. However, we should see in this upsurge an energetic spark, signaling the potential of future developments and maturation of the workers' defensive struggle. While the outbreak of spontaneous proletarian response in the streets disrupted the repressive activities of the bourgeois state for a time and shatters the veneer of social peace, such protest must develop into collectively coordinated labor action to deprive capital of its surplus value lifeblood, starving capital in order to force the enemy to make real concessions on workers' demands, grinding down its profit accumulation for a time, something street riots and protests cannot accomplish on their own. For this reason, We must reject the dead ends offered by bourgeois politicians and its left wing, whether humanitarian appeals, legal reforms, or interclass activist coalitions and mobilizations. Attempts to appeal to human rights, which mean nothing under capitalism, legal reforms, or interclass coalitions such as activist organizations only serve to obscure the true nature of the conflict and divert the working class from its task towards dead ends. Legislative strategies and appeals to the sympathies of the less bourgeois parties neutralize proletarian strength by tying it to the bourgeois order. As long as the dictatorship of capital remains intact, supported by its prisons, armies, and laws, every reform won is always temporary. Every legal protection is revocable. The way forward, then, is a program of working class unity and class-based organization that prepares the ground for broader, coordinated struggle, including mass strikes that can force real concessions and strengthen proletarian power. Immigrant workers face a tremendous struggle and will need to organize beyond the narrow confines of legality that the business union leaders ultimately must comply with as the peacekeepers for the bourgeoisie. It will require the strength and combativity of the rank and file workers to join together and stand in solidarity with our working class comrades and not only return to the strikes of yesterday, but to build towards the great general strikes of tomorrow. In conclusion, as we close this section of the meeting, let us look to the future and move forward our fight. We will continue to do the collective work of the party, the one revolutionary party of the working class, carrying forward Marxism unadulterated. Carrying forward Marxism unadulterated by the opportunism rife in capitalist society. Organizing and fighting alongside the working class and contributing to the long and historic struggle for communism. Let's go forth to organize our workplaces, to build the working class's ability to act collectively against its enemy and against attacks on our immigrant worker siblings. Bringing together elements of the labor movement, fighting on a combative class unionist basis to form a class union front and coordinate across the working class. From organization within unions controlled by opportunist leadership, we must unite militant workers and oppose collaborationism and nationalism from within the unions. All of this paves the way as conditions mature to generalized strike action and class combativity capable of putting up a real fight against the capitalist class's attacks on immigrants and the working class as a whole. The working class remakes the world every single day under capitalism. And within the world's productive capacity, which is at the point of being overripe, burdened by capitalist social relations, and ready to be freed from those social relations to benefit all of humanity. The working class and its party is historically positioned to overthrow the capitalist class and usher in the communist mode of production. We can look forward to a better world to come without exploitation, poverty, insane economic crises, and war. The working class can also look forward to a world without national borders and without the compulsion for millions of workers to migrate in search of work. But this can only be brought about by the overthrowing of capitalism and its replacement with a communist society in which people give according to ability and take according to need. It can only be achieved through the seizure of power by the only force that can transform society, the working class led by the International Communist Party.